Hello, welcome. I'm Susie. This is my podcast. I have a confession. When I feel sad, which is a lot, I find comfort in watching documentary films about World War II, and specifically films about the years leading up to the war and the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. I sometimes worry that if my media consumption is being monitored by some kind of state authority, that I'm on a kind of watch list. I also watch a ton of stuff on the Civil War and the years subsequent to that period and how race politics and the influence of the KKK preceded and presaged the formation of the Nazi Party. I also enjoy murder documentaries, archaeology documentaries, and walks on the beach. But what is my fascination with Nazis all about? And why am I feeling like it's necessary to air these very awkward and uncomfortable thoughts to my fellow humans? It's certainly not about admiration or respect. No, quite to the contrary. I think it's mostly about the comfort and satisfaction of knowing they got. They failed spectacularly. And for a brief moment in the context of history, the whole world said, "Never again," as we shook our fists in the air. And then we slowly forgot about it and let it happen again and again and again. Never again on the same scale, but still. Genocides, ethnic cleansings, violent repressive regimes have continued to rise up, and the U.S. has not been quite so indignant about them. Since the end of World War II, there's been authoritarian creep all over the world. Outside of the Soviet Union, which was an entirely autocratic regime that ruled an enormous area of geography over the earth and consequently a proportionately sized influence over stage of world politics for decades, political oppression has happened inside and out of the U.S. Democracies have arisen and fallen back. However, in the post-war era, the major distinction has been there has been some attempt at consequences for those acts within the international community. Our memories have been short enough to allow oppressive regimes to take hold, but not so short that we're not prepared to deal directly with the actions themselves and hold leaders accountable. Personally, I think that the echoes of the Nazi regime can be seen and felt all over the place. It's as though we've reached the limits of our memories with regard to how they came to rise, the destruction that they wrought, and the specific harm they did to people all over the world, especially Jews. And Americans, in their glorious hypocrisy, are walking right into the traps that have been set for them to erode the foundations of democracy all by themselves, using the tools of democracy to do it. It's a pretty familiar tactic, so why are so many people falling for it? Let's talk about the Nazis. There are periods throughout history where all the aspects of the prism of human existence are clearly visible, but only in retrospect. The effect is a little like gazing at one of those 3D optical illusion pictures that were really popular at one time. When the hidden image becomes clear, it's a forceful representation of the chaos of existence and humanity's eternal struggle to find order in it. I fear that as a pattern-seeking species, we're predisposed to only look backwards for any true understanding of the darkness of our nature, as though its existence in the past somehow means it no longer exists now in a way that we have to confront it. Much in the same way that my psyche wants me to watch films about Nazis and the Nuremberg trials and then be like, phew, glad that's over, and then I can pretend that there aren't still Nazis. As I observe it, any truth we arrive at is only felt or held onto briefly enough to confirm our internally held moral convictions, but in a way that it seldom informs our future action. We seem incapable of accepting truths that conflict with our perception of reality. Americans are not unique in this conflict or outright hypocrisy, but our signature is unique. Our brand is influential, and the forging of the American brand of hypocrisy, cloaked in the glory of American exceptionalism, cultivated the most graphically barbaric crimes against humanity for the last 400 years. I've said before, and I don't think I contradict myself in any way when I say that I think America was created on two conflicting keystones: the equality of all mankind, using that word very purposefully here, and white supremacy. Only the first one of those was controversial in any way at the time of the birth of our nation. I've discussed that before. I'll discuss it again. I'll keep discussing it until it's no longer worth discussing, which I predict will not be in my lifetime. Now, since I'm here today to talk about Nazis, let's go ahead and fast forward to the 1920s, a time in America of relative economic prosperity after a long and grueling war in Europe. Also, a time when Jim Crow segregation had a full and firm grip on Southern society and politics. A time when Northern liberals were pushing back against a tide of emerging American aristocracy and a widening wealth gap that largely disadvantaged immigrants. America has had a long and confusing relationship with immigration, as I've touched on in previous pods. But as a white supremacist country, we mostly were against it. In Germany, Hitler was a poor Austrian vet of World War I. He had a tyrannical father who wanted him to go into a government job and a doting mother who encouraged him to follow his dreams. He was a failed artist with a talent for oratory and a weird kind of charisma formed by his mother's adulation. He had nutty ideas, but he liked the idea of reclaiming the imperial glory that the Austro-Hungarian Empire failed to achieve, and that Germany surely would succeed at because of their natural superiority as a race. It was fringy, but not enough to consign him to the tinfoil hat brigade, and some people who had limited influence in political circles and who desired more thought that he could be useful. But he was a sociopath and a monster, it turns out. And they fed and fed him like that big plant in the Little Shop of Horrors until he ate up almost all of Europe, including all the people that cultivated his growth. When Hitler arrived in Germany, the country was reeling from its loss of the war and the ultra-punishing sanctions of the Versailles Treaty. And the only way they could survive the economic devastation was to borrow copiously from the Western nations, particularly America, fueling a potent economic surge in both nations. At that point, Hitler became much less interesting because people didn't need his grievance politics during a time of plenty. Let's fast forward again to the 1930s. Shit has changed. Big time. The Depression rocks the entire world like an asteroid impact. All that money Germany borrowed, they can't pay for those loans. American banks continue to fail, and the American economy continues to spiral. Millions of people lose their jobs, their homes, and any sense of security that they may once have had. In Germany, things are crazy hard. Hyperinflation destroys the entire economy, and the fledgling democracy struggles to find a political identity to sustain its self-governance. Communist Party actions gain strength as people look for ways to improve their situation, but the fear of communism in Europe was perhaps even more potent than in the US, and Hitler's grievance politics sounded good to millions of Germans who felt totally out of control of their lives. He talked about the halcyon days when Germans were proud and took care of their own people, and people responded to that with powerful vigor and support. While Hitler was serving a prison sentence for treason, treason, for his failed insurrection attempt in the early 20s, a convicted traitor, he wrote a book. I know you've heard about it. It's gross. He's gross. We don't need to cover much of it, but it sold a lot of copies. People in Germany really respond to it. He was like a rock star for a while. And when he resurfaced as a, cleaned up politician with legitimate political backers, and he talked about how communists were going to break Germany and they should jettison democracy because it wasn't working and trust him to get them back on track. The German people were like, yay, let's do that. I mean, they knew about his thoughts on Jews when they elected him, and most of them really thought it would never actually take shape into anything, and some of them thought it sounded right to them. By the late 1930s, the concentration camp system had been firmly established, and hundreds of thousands of Jews, disabled persons, Romani, political dissidents, and political prisoners were being routinely imprisoned, tortured, and killed. The systematic destruction of the Jews had not yet been dreamed of, but the groundwork had been laid, and the danger was clear. The U.S. State Department maintained a policy deliberately not allowing Jewish refugees into the U.S. during the Holocaust, consistent with the U.S.'s foundational white supremacist policies. The U.S. government had copious credible intelligence at that time of the magnitude of the slaughter, and Congress repeatedly voted not to allow substantive numbers of Jewish immigrants into the country. They co-signed the murders of millions of people on behalf of their constituents. In the end, only 225,000 Jewish refugees were permitted to come to the U.S. through the entirety of the period leading up to the end of the war in 1945. A general sense of xenophobia has been present in core American values throughout our history. Xenophobia, after all, is a supporting pillar of white supremacy. Anti-Semitism has a rich history in the U.S., and the American public's seemingly indifferent reaction to the mass execution of Jews during World War II is a good indicator of that. Hitler took great inspiration from America's segregation policies. He was also powerfully persuaded by the ideas that were promoted by eugenicists who believed in a bunch of kooky bullshit about how different races, ethnicities, or other abled people indicated a sort of value ranking, allowing us to basically engineer the perfect human in their estimation. These ideas were his foundation for the Nuremberg laws that defined German citizenship based on the amount of Jewish blood a person had. Hitler was gobsmacked that America declared war against Germany. He thought for sure that we would be simpatico with his whole pitch. American fascists enjoyed a period of expressive freedom in the 1920s and 30s. After all, at that point, it wasn't at all clear the sort of tragedy that would ensue as a result of fascist action. There was a group of fascists called the Silver Shirts who wore SA-like uniforms, but their shirts were silver, obviously. There were mass rallies of support with attendees up to 20,000 strong of Nazi Americans. The America First Committee, which vigorously argued against U.S. involvement in the war, were openly sympathetic to Nazi Party principles and held them up as consistent with American values. Henry Ford was an open and flagrant anti-Semite and published a paper that boasted the number 2 spot in circulation for a time, and it was called The International Jew. I mean, you can guess what that mostly was about. There were also tons of people who wouldn't shut up about the atrocities being committed and who insisted that America should be the leading force to stop it. Journalists, politicians, faith leaders, thousands of people who stood firm against the overwhelming tide of white apathy. People like Dorothy Thompson, a journalist with Harper's, who at one point was expelled from Germany for reporting on Nazi violence against Jews and political opponents. Frances Perkins, the first woman in the cabinet. I think she was Secretary of Labor. And Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady and a fully fledged badass. Those voices won out in the endgame of the war, but only after a direct attack on the country roused the fear of the nation to the point that they could no longer deny what was happening. And all that capitulation counted in the cost of human lives and a trauma visited upon the world. In one respect, it was just another culling of humanity, as has occurred throughout history. And I say that not to diminish the gravity of those events, but to point to the fact of their preventability. You know, like our own calamity is not inevitable. We are very often the authors of our own tragedies, as well as the muse for all our heroes. Adolf Hitler and the rise of the Nazis, with the benefit of an historical outlook, look very similar to the ascension of Trump and the ultra-right Republican Party. I don't know what to call it. I guess the MAGA Party? Though that sounds stupid. So does Nazi, though, I guess. So whatever. Now, that thing I just said feels taboo to say. We don't talk about Nazis as an American society. It's become colloquial in a way, like we can only use it ironically in order not to seem like we're engaged in some sort of false equivalency histrionics. We don't like to talk about the stuff that makes us uncomfortable as Americans. It's a very Protestant-based impulse in my estimation, and it sucks because it's just yet another self-imposed prison. Anyway, I digress. Here are a few of the correlations that I observe. The morally corrupt, weirdly charismatic, slightly unorthodox leader who expertly wields grievance politics. He can access people's fears and leverage them to his advantage. He does this mostly using the cudgel of otherness. For Hitler, this otherness was very direct. It was the Jews, no question. He was not ambiguous about it at any point. Trump differs in this respect because he seems to not have any sort of strongly held convictions of any kind apart from, I win. But he still repeatedly presents himself as an avatar for the right sort of American who remembers what it was like when things were easy and they were respected. Those are white Protestant Christian Americans. So the otherness for Americans is much broader, but in their galaxy of otherness, Jews still feature prominently as a problematic group in much the same way that they were for Hitler and Ford and Woodrow Wilson. After the Holocaust, people can't be openly anti-Semitic without consequences, just like people can't be openly racist without consequences. So they find codes, ways to talk about otherness that still resonates with their audience. Otherness in political action. George Soros is a modern-day effigy for the oldest of anti-Semitic tropes, all rolled up into a single scapegoat within modern politics. He's a wealthy Jewish American of Hungarian origin who contributes to democratic political causes. Soros' name is being invoked frequently by right-wing politicians, pundits, and activists as a dark influence. He's represented by as few words as possible as the center of a web of control, secretly maneuvering for power and world domination. Like, for real, this is what they think. They weren't worried about the Koch brothers' political contributions, nor the Sacklers. Soros gets this dubious honor precisely because he is Jewish. It would be laughable, except for the naked fact of our own collective stupidity. We are so willing to look away rather than confront our own shame that we're willing to accept the most obvious logical fallacies as objective truths. And born on the back of faith, Protestant values of humility, modesty, and charity transformed through American vanity and white supremacy into a mild form of nationalism, a willing denial of the moral depravity of white supremacy and a tendency towards xenophobia, much like how the German citizens were able to look away under those same values. Paramilitary support of extremist actors permeating into state institutions. When the Nazis were coming to power, people didn't really take them seriously. They were just a noisy bunch of dorks cheering for each other in bars. It was like almost sad. But they got themselves worked up, and there were enough people suffering and looking for a place of safety. And a lot like gangs, they gathered and found safety in their own numbers. Ernst Röhm was a devout Nazi, and he was also a leader in the German military. He spent years cultivating supporters in his own ranks, and these were a huge portion of what became the SA, the Nazi stormtroopers, the brown shirts. The SA were violent thugs who attacked and beat people, mostly Jews, in the streets, and the cops mostly did nothing to stop them, a lot because they knew a lot of them and they were sort of sympathetic. Today, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters and the Boogaloo Boys, all these different private militia groups who have weird intersections with political activists emerge, and we see things happen like Charlottesville in 2017 and on January 6th, 2021. In the US, we see numerous examples of people with white supremacist ideology on police forces and in the military at a growing pace. Efforts to combat this are met with outrage on the part of Republicans who deny the premise and accuse the accusers of impinging their First Amendment rights. It's really slimy. It's like just how the Nazis pressured and intimidated otherwise ambivalent Germans to sign on to the Nazi Party so that they wouldn't be targeted. Erosion of democratic norms. Germany was a new democracy after the end of World War I. Up until that point, it had been under some form of imperialistic or monarchic rule, and there were centuries of struggle and war that made its borders both fungible and diminished. They were shaken as a nation and struggled to know what their identity was in this new world where they were the shame of the world. When the Nazis came to power, they rode the wave of economic despair that their people were being tossed around under, and they brought forth a period of growth and industry and wealth for the right sort of people, true Germans. In order to do this, they stole the wealth of their own citizens and locked them up in ghettos and concentration camps. They did this through legislative action, not through revolution. Their revolution failed, so they clawed their way to power on the back of propaganda and psychological warfare. And the Germans didn't seem to care. They'd reclaimed their pride. Donald Trump and the most right-wing part of the Republican Party had a different sort of wave to catch. After 8 years under a black president, a whole bunch of white people in this country felt very, very threatened. White supremacy, as a keystone concept in our country's formation, is not a joke. It sits with millions of Americans as a fundamental truth of their existence. People like this saw their chance at a comeback using a man who inspired strong feelings in everyone he encountered. They gave him money, platforms, mass media to get his message out, and they either enabled or were directly complicit with or were willingly ignorant of a foreign government's interference in our elections. As president, Donald Trump dismissed, ignored, or subverted almost every democratic norm that you can imagine. He didn't read his PDBs, the presidential daily briefings. He pulled the director of the FBI into a private dinner and demanded his loyalty. And then once he didn't get it, he fired him. He issued military orders relating to trans people in the military via tweet and without bothering to discuss it with the Joint Chiefs. Republicans in Congress were more than happy to join the fun, and they too continuously challenged democratic norms in things that they did and said with no apparent consequences. I mean, every once in a while a member would be censured, and Angus King was dispelled at one point for obliquely racist remarks, but not anymore. Paul Gosar tweeted an animated image depicting the decapitation of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and just recently, Tommy Tuberville said that white nationalists should totally be allowed to serve in the military, and the effort to remove people who openly express these ideals was an attack on American values. Legislative social control. The Nazis had total social control over German citizens. They even had a breeding program. They controlled all media and education. The elimination of Jews from German society was decreed by law. Once the Nuremberg laws were passed, Jews were no longer citizens. They couldn't work in professional jobs like teaching or accounting or law anymore, and they certainly couldn't serve in government. Then they couldn't own property, then they couldn't live except in special areas, and then they just couldn't live. Children for over 20 years in Germany were educated in schools that Hitler was like a god, an infallible leader, and that Jews were inherently evil. At the end of the war, as the Soviets were approaching Berlin's city limits, the only soldiers left fighting were children, as young as 12, who refused to lay down their arms because they felt it was their duty to die for Hitler. Hitler shot himself before the Soviets could get him. Right now, all across the U.S., a wave of authoritarian legislative actions focused on attacks on LGBTQ plus people, women, and communities of color is rolling all over us. The overturning of Roe v. Wade, voter suppression efforts continue as they have for decades, but also in education. The banning of books, firing of teachers, taking over of school boards, and the passing of legislation defining what can and can't be taught in school. Tried and tested tools in America's white supremacy toolbox, and courting anti-democratic actors to maintain power where it already has amassed power. In characteristic American style, there seems to be no trouble in the apparent contradiction between screaming about free speech in one breath and then screaming that drag queens are coming for your children in the next. It's just the kind of stupidity that a whole bunch of white Americans vibe with. There's a subtler distinction, too, that's more insidious and reminds me a lot of the ways in which the Nazis maintained their power under such an oppressive regime, which is to say that political attacks on legislative policies or state programs that seek to achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion as a form of liberal indoctrination. It seems so obviously nonsensical, but it's a powerful argument precisely because it centers on children and the protective instincts that their parents have. If you attack free thought, you can much more easily control people. For a time now, I've sensed a moment of optimistic relief with the election of an elderly, tepid career politician by 80 million Americans in an election with the most turnout in our entire history. And that says to me that Americans believe pretty passionately in an American ideal of some kind. And 80 million people believe passionately in the principles of democracy and see a clear and present danger to its survival. I mean, to be honest, I don't believe that Joe Biden measures up to FDR. But history may yet prove me wrong. I believe that if one looks at America in an objective and honest way, you see both a collection of signs that speak to inevitable conflict of violent and significant magnitude, and also a force of progress and humanity in the best and highest sense that continues to resist oppression. We have yet to know how this historical moment will unfold. There are shadows of past mistakes and misjudgments, but this isn't Germany, and the world is a very different place now. The struggle is part of us. As Americans, it's never going away. Democracy is a cruel master, and it requires constant work. That's why I see our collective effort in the project as essential. No one of us can keep it going on our own. No single leader will ever encapsulate all that we are and will be as a nation. And that's a good thing, and we should keep it that way.